Why are some countries incredibly rich while others seem trapped in poverty? It's one of the biggest, most fundamental questions in all of economics. Well, back in 2001, three economists, Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, published a really groundbreaking paper. They proposed a powerful and pretty controversial historical explanation for this gap. So let's dive in and break down their argument.
Okay, before we go any further, it's absolutely crucial that we're clear on something. What we're about to discuss is a specific economic theory. We're focusing on just one factor that might have influenced long-term economic growth. This is in no way a moral judgment on colonialism itself, which of course had deeply harmful and tragic human consequences that are still felt today. Our focus here is purely analytical, looking at the economic argument presented in the paper.
So here's the game plan. We'll start with that core question about wealth and poverty. Then we'll dig into how a very specific part of geography played a hidden role in colonial strategies. We'll see how this led to a massive fork in the road, creating different kinds of institutions. And then we'll look at why those institutions have lasted so long and check out the evidence connecting it all. Right, so the starting point for everything is this huge, glaring gap in income we see around the world. For years, economists have debated what causes it. Is it geography? Is it culture? Is it access to technology? Well, this paper argues that a massive piece of the puzzle is something else entirely, a country's institutions. To really get why institutions, the rules of the game for an economy, matters so much, just look at Germany after World War II. You had the same people, the same geography, the same culture. But they were split under two completely different sets of economic rules. West Germany, with its market economy and private property, absolutely thrived. East Germany, under central planning, just stagnated. It's a perfect natural experiment that shows institutions have a huge impact on whether a country gets rich or stays poor. So if institutions are the answer, where do today's good and bad institutions come from? The authors argue we have to go way back to the colonial period. And what decided the kind of institutions Europeans set up? Well, here's the twist. The answer is geography, but probably not in the way you're thinking. The key variable was the danger to the colonizers themselves, specifically their risk of dying from disease.
So let's be super clear. This theory isn't saying that hot climates make countries poor. Not at all. It's way more specific. It's about how the local disease environment, the germs and viruses in a place, completely changed the game for European colonizers who had no immunity.
We're talking mainly about invisible killers like malaria and yellow fever. And here's the critical piece of the puzzle. There was a huge difference in who was at risk. The local populations had lived in these environments for generations, so many adults had developed immunity. But for the European settlers who had never been exposed, these diseases were often a death sentence.
And the death rates were just unbelievable. Look at the statistic from Sierra Leone. In a single year, almost 3/4 of the European settlers died. This wasn't just a small risk. It was a game-changing, catastrophic threat that completely altered the calculus of colonization.
So this massive difference in settler mortality, whether Europeans could survive or not, created a huge fork in the road. It basically forced the colonial powers to choose between two totally different strategies. On one path, in places where death rates were low, like in North America or Australia, lots of Europeans could actually move and settle down. They created what the paper calls neo-Europes, and they demanded the same kinds of protections they had back home: strong property rights, courts, and limits on what the government could do. But on the other path, where mortality was sky high, like in much of West Africa or the Congo, large-scale settlement was impossible. So the goal became purely extractive. It was all about getting in, taking resources like rubber or minerals, and getting out. The institutions they built for this were the complete opposite. They were designed for control and plunder, with no checks on power.
Okay, but you might be thinking, that was centuries ago. All these countries are independent now. Why would these colonial rules still matter? That's a great question, and it gets us to this core idea of institutional persistence.
Just so we're all on the same page, when we say institutions, we just mean the rules of the game. Things like property rights, whether your contracts will be enforced by a court, and limits on government power. These rules basically shape all the incentives in an economy, whether it's a good idea to start a business, go to school, or save for the future.
So why are these institutions so hard to change? Well, a few reasons. First, overhauling a country's entire legal and political system is just incredibly expensive and difficult. Second, when independence came, the new leaders often found that the old extractive systems were actually pretty useful for them to stay in power and enrich themselves. And finally, over time, the whole economy gets built around these rules, creating powerful groups that don't want anything to change.
All right, so that's the theory. It's a really compelling story. But is there any hard data to actually back it up? This is where the paper goes from a cool idea to a really powerful piece of research.
The whole argument really rests on this logical chain of events. It starts with a disease environment, which leads to settler mortality. That mortality rate shapes the colonial strategy, which determines the early institutions. Those early institutions tend to stick around, becoming today's institutions. And finally, today's institutions determine how rich or poor a country is.
So the authors crunched the numbers, and what they found is pretty stunning. This chart shows the core finding. On the horizontal axis, you have settler mortality rates from centuries ago. On the vertical axis, you have income per person today. And that clear downward slope tells the story. Countries where settlers faced a higher risk of death back then are, on average, much, much poorer today.
And it gets even more specific. Their statistical analysis suggests that more than a quarter of the difference we see in the quality of institutions across the world today can be explained by just that one factor, settler mortality rates from way back when. It's an incredible example of how history casts a long, long shadow.
And the impact here isn't small, it's enormous. The model suggests that if a country like Nigeria, which inherited more extractive institutions, could somehow adopt the institutional quality of a country like Chile, its income per person could increase 7 times over in the long run. That is a life-changing difference.
And here's one of the paper's most radical findings. Once you account for the quality of institutions that a country has, other big theories about poverty, like being located in Africa or near the equator, suddenly stop being statistically significant. It suggests it's not about the latitude, it's about the institutions.
So let's pull all of this together. Why does this theory matter so much for how we think about helping countries develop today? The key takeaway, really, is that history has a powerful and persistent grip on the present. The path a country was set on hundreds of years ago really, really matters. It tells us that good institutions, things like property rights and the rule of law, are a fundamental cause of wealth, not just something that rich countries happen to have.
The authors put it very directly in this quote. They argue that the poverty we see in parts of the world isn't some kind of destiny written by geography or culture, but rather, it's a direct outcome of the institutions they inherited from this historical process. And that leaves us with a final and very difficult question. If a country's economic destiny is so deeply rooted in history, what does it actually take to change it today? How can you break out of that path dependency? The theory gives us a powerful diagnosis for the problem, but finding the cure is still one of the biggest challenges in all of economics.